linking up with that Northeastern program in a North American emissions trading scheme, which they will then try to expand to other states. The Midwestern Regional Greenhouse Gas Accord is recommending that Midwestern states adopt cap and trade starting in 2012. I would recommend that all of the states in that program get out of it before that happens. I think it would be an enormous mistake for the Midwest in particular, with a struggling manufacturing base, to adopt state-level cap and trade programs. And I'll point out that the economic analysis that's been done of cap and trade at the state level shows that it costs as much as 10 times more for a given level of emissions permits than a national program, because it's a lot easier to move across state lines than it is across national lines. Not to say people won't leave the country as well, but there are enormous economic consequences. Now, the current RGGI program in the Northeast has set the permit price at a very, very low level. They did that for a couple reasons. First, they didn't want it to have a big impact that people would notice, so it's relatively low. It's hidden in the rate base, but it's also relatively low. But also they wanted to get political buy-in from all of the regulated entities, so they would all go lobby Washington together for a national program, and they'd all get rich. So you can buy the permits in RGGI now for about $1.85 per ton. They're all hoping a federal program will make them worth $40. Lisa Jackson, who designed the regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast, is now the administrator of the EPA, who's been pushing for a federal program that'll give them all these windfalls. Federal program now looks unlikely. The price has collapsed of permits in the Northeast. We've got to repeal the program, which is now nothing more than a hidden tax. Legislation to do that's been introduced in New Jersey by Allison McCose and Mike Doherty. We're working to get it introduced in the rest of those northeastern states. And if any folks here are from, it's now been introduced in New Hampshire, and we're working on Maine as well. And I think New Hampshire and Maine are states where we've got a great, great opportunity to get it passed. In New Hampshire, where we're veto-proof, I think we can get that to happen. And if New Hampshire or Maine pull out, I think we can put tremendous pressure on Chris Christie, who's been supportive of cap and trade, to reverse that position, which I think is critical for his national ambitions. And if a big state like New Jersey pulls out, it will collapse. And we've got to stop other regions from going down the cap and trade path as well. So that's critical. That's sort of the state level initial fight on cap and trade. But then there's what I think Obama was directly referring to, which is skinning the cat by having the EPA adopt cap and trade and other greenhouse gas regulations by backdoor means. And the Supreme Court opened the door to this in 2007 with their Massachusetts versus EPA decision. It was a 5-4 decision. Kennedy went with the lefties on this one. And what they basically said was the EPA must decide whether or not to adopt global warming regulations inside the 1970 Clean Air Act, which was adopted at a time where no one had heard of global warming yet, and that the Al Gore hadn't even invented the internet yet, let alone global warming. Nonetheless, the Supreme Court said you've got to decide based on the language of the statute whether you ought to regulate global warming under the Clean Air Act. And the language of the statute is so clear that this was never intended to be applied. It creates such absurd results that the EPA, in order to respond to the court with a yes, we will regulate, they had to appoint themselves essentially the super legislature of the United States, rewrite the clear black letter thresholds that are in that law, and force the states to amend state law, to amend their state implementation plans under the Clean Air Act to comply not with what federal law says, but with what bureaucrats arbitrarily asserted. And what I'm referring to primarily here is the fact that in the Clean Air Act, the threshold for under the Prevention of Significant Deterioration program for requiring permitting is 100 tons. The EPA, it's written in the law, 100 tons. The EPA said, well, that's fine. For greenhouse gases, we'll set it at 75,000 tons because to actually apply the law as written would create absurd results, and administrative necessity requires us to do it that way. Now, a common sense person would say, the court said you have to decide based on the language of the statute. The language of the statute creates absurd results and an impossible administrative burden, millions of new permit applications across the country. So you ought to tell the court, under the language of the statute, we are choosing not to regulate. Instead, EPA said, we're going to rewrite the law. And they are coercing the states. They have told the states, you must amend your state implementation plan based on what we, unelected bureaucrats, want. You legislators, must amend your state laws to come into compliance with the new definitions that we've created. Most states are doing it. Many are suing because they don't agree with being forced to do it. One state in particular, the state of Texas, is outright refusing to comply. And I think that I think that the governor of Texas and the Attorney General Greg Abbott deserve an enormous amount of credit for this decision. It's especially high stakes for them because they're in an ongoing dispute with the EPA over their state permitting program broadly, and there's a threat of a federal takeover there, which will only be exacerbated by them pushing back on this. But I think that they're right, and I think that it's crucial that we stop this initial tailoring rule, which relates only to permitting for very large stationary sources. But if the EPA can dictate to the states that they must amend their state implementation plans under the Clean Air Act, it will open the door, in our view, towards forced state implementation of cap-and-trade programs, because there is no control technology for greenhouse gases. The control technology does not exist. And we believe that they will either adopt as best available control technology or, under the new source performance standards process, a requirement for an emissions trading scheme, and they will force states to adopt it under their state implementation plans based on the precedent that's being set right now with the tailoring rule if we don't successfully push back on that. So we may in fact have forced cap and trade at the state level, despite the fact the American people rejected it, despite the fact Congress rejected it, despite the fact that the regional programs are failing and we hope with our efforts will collapse, just by bureaucratic dictate. And I think it's critical that we stop that. And some of these suggestions in the TPPF agenda, I think, would go a long way towards pushing back on that. In particular, I think we need to have clarification from Congress that regulations cannot assert federal supremacy over state law, that Congress can do that, but that regulators cannot. I think that's a critical principle. I also think it's very important that we reform the regulatory approval process in Congress. And there's a crucial piece of legislation called the RAINS Act that's been introduced by Congressman Jeff Davis from Kentucky and Senator Jim DeMint of South Carolina. And this bill requires an affirmative vote of Congress before any major agency rulemaking can take effect. So it flips the presumption on its head. It says regulators can't just do whatever they want and Congress has to overturn it, but rather for major rules, they can only take effect with congressional approval. And we need to have a strong push behind that concept coming out from the states. And the states that don't already have similar laws should adopt that as well. There are many states that require for rules above a certain threshold to have legislative approval. I think it's a very sound principle that unelected regulators ought not to be creating policies that have enormous economic consequences. And so I think that's a very important piece of this puzzle. And just to scare you a little bit more, even if we stop this Clean Air Act regulatory threat on greenhouse gases, which I call sort of the one-level indirect threat to get cap and trade by the back door, there's a double indirect threat, which is a huge patchwork of extremely expensive EPA rules that don't directly target greenhouse gases, but are intended to cripple the coal industry, are intended to send electricity prices skyrocketing by targeting other things, much like they tried to protect forests by going for the spotted owl. And John Podesta, who was chairman of President Obama's transition team, former Clinton chief of staff, put out a report from his Center for American Progress about a week after the election. It's a 53-page report called Powers of the President, how we can, I don't remember the exact subtitle, but it was basically how we can push an aggressive, progressive agenda through the executive branch, disregard Congress, cheat the process, what have you. I don't think they use cheat the process in their subtitle, but you get my point. And it was interesting, the section on greenhouse gases didn't even mention EPA greenhouse gas regulation, what I just talked about, because perhaps they think that we're going to succeed and get Congress to step in and stop that. What they did mention, they had about 5 bullet points of how other regulations that have a pretext of being about other things will actually have an enormous impact on greenhouse gases and global warming. And what they're talking about there are things like the new out-of-cycle ozone rules, which are going to put just about every metropolitan area and just about every one of your states out of compliance, be enormously expensive to comply with, cost millions and millions of jobs, and have a major impact on petroleum refining, which will send the price of gasoline up, which of course is one of their objectives. Things like the maximum achievable control technology for industrial boilers, which will have a big impact on electricity prices, also on other industrial facilities. And they also call for a new power plant toxics rule in that, which they say will pretend to be about mercury and other toxics, but really will be so extreme that it'll stop all coal-fired power plants. We'll be able to decommission them. We'll be able to get at that end that Obama talked about of skinning the cat some other way. And so I think that we need to have a very aggressive, across-the-board pushback at what the EPA is doing. It has to include demanding that Congress step in and take responsibility and overturn some of these things, pass process reform like the REINS Act. We need to have states resisting forced changes to their state implementation